Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. You're listening to a show that is all about ideas, about the search for wisdom and knowledge through conversation. My guests all have something to say, and they have the credentials to say it persuasively. Here, the conversation continues. Thank you for joining me for Season 7 of the Optimistic Curmudgeon. I'm your host, Josh Herring. My guest today is Emily Jashinsky, D.C. correspondent for Unherd and former culture editor at The Federalist. I heard Emily speak at the 4th National Conservatism Conference in D.C. this past July, and I'm excited to get to talk with her today. Emily, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Thank you for having me.
Well, before we get into all of our various topics today, I'm hoping that I'm sure we'll get to some spicy stuff. I mean, we're talking about porn, capitalism, technology, AI, all kinds of things. Tell us a bit of your story. How did you get into journalism, and what's going on with this move over to Unherd?
Sure. Yeah, no, I grew up in Wisconsin and wanted to dabble in politics and media in particular. I was always very interested in media, so I went to school here in DC and worked for a nonprofit out of college doing kind of campus advocacy for conservative kids on campus, the Young America's Foundation. And as soon as the job opened up at the Washington Examiner on the commentary desk, I applied for that after a couple of years. Spent a couple of years at the Examiner, spent about 6 years with my good friends at the Federalist, and jumped over to Unherd to launch a new show called Undercurrents just a few months ago, where we cover the news and the ideas we say that matter beneath the surface, which is super fun because there's always something percolating beneath the discourse that deserves more attention. So we're doing that every day.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that sounds so much like your talk at NatCon, where I didn't really know what I was coming to when I came to the big tech panel. And then it was all these really interesting observations about the way technology affects or is used, particularly in terms of pornography, but also in terms of kind of broad understandings of human nature, of sexuality, all kinds of other things. So that seems to be somewhat of your focus then. That seems like it's a great fit.
Yeah, I love the culture war and conversations about the culture war and the media, and a lot of those conversations actually happening on the right about capitalism and how it's influenced media coverage, Hollywood coverage of those issues. So it was a pleasure to join that panel.
Well, let's get into it. You started your talk with the claim that, quote, modern pornography is not natural. What do you mean by that? How is modern pornography different from, say, cave paintings in Lascaux or genitalia street signs in Pompeii?
It's a really good question because the impulse that pornography plays on is the most natural impulse. It's hard to get more natural than the impulses that pornography itself is obviously tethered to. But that said, something that's deeply unnatural is having the ability to watch strangers across the entire world dip into their lives for 2 minutes, 10 minutes, however long it is, and watch them in the most intimate of acts. And to have that accessible in your pocket with you wherever you go, whether you have a Wi-Fi connection or a cellular connection, it's right there in your pocket. You can dip into these strangers' lives at any given moment and watch them for a snippet of time. You have no context. You don't know if there's abuse involved. You don't have any interest really in that person's well-being. You're using that for your own sort of sexual gratification in the moment. You're using their sexual gratification, or at least their performed sexual gratification, for your own sexual gratification, primarily for the time period that you're dipping into their lives. So it's incredibly unnatural to have that accessible, again, in your pocket at any time of day, wherever you are, at any moment. It's right there. So there's nothing natural about that. So that's kind of what I meant in that point.
It's the access is such an interesting angle here, and it's become such a part of the growth of the cell phone technology just over the last, say, 10, 15 years. And I remember being 20 years ago, being 15, and it was perfectly normal to not have a phone if you weren't driving. But today, if you don't have a phone and you are, I think even as young as 12, it's somehow really bizarre. I was reading somebody last week who argued that the limb, in a way, or in addition to the body, and that's the example used in the essay was like when I'd see it, just watch a group of teenagers walking around town, and they all have the exact same pose with their hands outstretched and a cell phone in it. And the argument was that this just becomes it's why we feel so personally attached to our phones. I think it's so interesting that now that's so widespread, and they're widespread for all kinds of reasons, but it seems to me not nearly enough attention has been given to the fact that this new device becomes such an avenue to all kinds of pernicious content. There also seems to be something very interesting happening in the way I'm fascinated with the art history angle on the artistic nude. It was often a stylized form. It was very rarely an actual person that's being portrayed in a Greek sculpture or classical painting or something of that nature. But that idealization was supposed to enable people to better understand what the human form is supposed to be. Well, we've taken the opposite tact, and we've now got real people portraying real bodies, and yet we're further away from actually interacting with real people than we've ever been before. And that all just seems to be such an interesting collection of factors in our modern day.
Yeah, and I mean, even if we take the crudest, say Girls Gone Wild on a cave painting, take the most crude form of modern pornography and say that's what people were doing on caves. That of course people have always been depicting sex for the purpose of sexual gratification, not merely for the purpose of art. Sometimes those two things are combined. But sometimes, it is just purely for the purpose of gratification. Of course, that's always happened. But it's incredibly different when you are looking at the real life of a stranger. I mean, so in cave painting era, you couldn't even paint someone. I mean, just think about this. You couldn't even paint someone who's on the other side of the world in a real pose. I mean, you could imagine what someone on the other side of the world might look like. And that doesn't seem like a big deal, but it is, because our physical communal ties to the people around us make us invested in the physical space and the social space around us in different ways than we are with someone who we will literally never meet. We have no reason, really, we have no reason to immediately care about the well-being of a person who was filmed for pornography in Thailand, when we will absolutely never meet them. We have no idea what was happening outside the frame of the video or of the picture, and we can't because we don't know anyone involved, likely, and we won't. We don't know that girl's family. We don't know anything, or that man's family. There's just so much that is unknown, but that is utterly real in a way that paintings that happened in a very specific time and place are not.
And that too is really just fascinating, the way that the technology enables the transmission of this information across such spaces and time. And then even to the point that now these elements are stable on the internet to some degree. And it's not the case. I mean, hypothetically, once upon a time, if there was a photo that was being taken and being given without consent to some publication, the actual master of that photo could be destroyed. The actual copies of that photo could be tracked down and destroyed. But there's something about the infinite reproducibility of technology that I think is increasingly damaging, because there are. I'm in education. I work with a lot of teachers, and I've been rather appalled to see stories of teachers who are moonlighting on OnlyFans. I mean, there are now multiple teachers who have lost their jobs because their students found their OnlyFans accounts, and then administration finds out, and then teachers are gone, and they're. But that digital footprint is permanent, and it's more permanent than the analog material copies of such photographs were decades ago. And that too seems to be a change.
Yeah, major. And it's when I think Louise Perry has persuasively pointed out the maybe the most frightening problem with is people can revoke their consent. There are numerous cases of women, and I'm sure men, who have been involved in have consensually been involved in pornography, and who have come to deeply regret being involved in that pornography and want all of those videos taken down, no longer consent to people consuming something that has already been recorded. And while that's a separate legal question, and it's one that people are grappling with right now because it's sort of new and difficult, just morally, you have no idea whether any person in any video has revoked their consent, has incredible regrets about being recorded in that. And, that would give any decent person, I have moral objections to pornography in the first place, but say somebody doesn't, and they consume pornography, that should give them, any decent person, pause when they're consuming pornography, whether someone came to see that act as a form of rape, whether someone came to see that act as a form of sexual assault and they didn't realize it at the time, or frankly, they just regret it morally later on, which does happen to a lot of people. That should change people's belief in whether it's morally acceptable to consume it, but you really have no way of knowing, and you really have no way of taking it out of the internet once it's there.
That moral dynamic is again just so interesting and so complex because and it pushes at something I've been really, another interest of mine over recent years is the limits of consent as a framework for sexual ethics. A couple of years ago, I ran across a legal monograph. It was a Scottish lawyer who wrote a whole volume on just the idea that we've leaned on in American law, we've leaned on sexual consent as sort of our go-to principle to decide if an action is permissible, but it raises the very issues that you're describing. At what point is consent given? At what point can consent be rejected? Or withdrawn? At what point is consent compromised by power differentials? At what point and then when you factor in kind of social pressures, economic pressures, does verbal consent actually get into all of or does verbal consent really cover that whole ground? But then there's even a prior consideration I wanted to ask you about today. I mean, you mentioned having personally that you have moral objections to pornography as a thing itself, and I'm kind of stuck wondering. I've not heard nearly enough people be willing to even raise the question or ask the question: to what degree can people actually consent to be abused, or can they consent to be? Because in one sense, I think this is analogous to slavery. We're pretty unified as a Western world at this point that it is not morally permissible to sell yourself into slavery. I'm currently teaching a Western Civ class, and we were just reading Hammurabi's Code, and there's a whole section in there about how if you are too indebted, you could sell your children into 3 years of debt slavery to get yourself out of hock, and then they're freed in the 4th year. So it's not even a total lifetime slavery. But we would never do that today. No matter how bad credit card debt is, no good person would think about, oh, I'm going to sell my kid to Visa. Like, we would never do that. We've spent the last 200 years to some degree figuring out that, nope, we actually do reject slavery as permissible human action in broad Western civilization. But we haven't had the same conversation to some degree when it comes to pornography. So this is a very broad, long-winded way of coming around to ask you, like, is this actually something? Do you think people can legitimately consent to this? Is it the kind of action that you can morally approve of and then engage in, or is it some different category of human action?
Right. Like if it's always abusive, if we accept that, there's a morally abusive, corrosive, necessarily effect of pornography. But, I maybe take a different approach to that you can consent to abuse. I mean, it just literally, you can consent to abuse in the most sort of like, again, literal sense of someone's physical, psychological decision making. But if we also, this is to your point about whether it's in a different category, if we also accept that it's always abusive, that takes away some of the agency. If the person who is filming it is always an abuser, although at the same time, if you have something like OnlyFans, I do think OnlyFans as a platform is abusive, but I also think the women who are willingly making money off of OnlyFans by selling, whether it's nude pictures, videos, whatever it is, then I also don't want to take away from the agency that they have to make that decision, which is why I have actually very complicated, despite having pretty strong objections to porn, I also have very complicated feelings on the legalization of prostitution, because honestly, I think it's important that we acknowledge the agency that women have to make these decisions and not undermine women's decision making to commodify what is the most intimate, what is the most personal part of their body. And when we regulate those things, we also take away people's agency to fully understand and grasp what that means. And so I'm not saying I totally believe in legal prostitution or porn, but I'm saying I actually do worry that we strip women of their
Mm.
agency in those decisions, because for some women, it absolutely is a fully empowered, and I mean empowered in the sense that it is a fully personal choice to make money that way, to use their body,
Mm.
to sell their body, to commodify what is fundamentally their most important possession, their own body, for the sake of profit. And again, I know that's really might sound odd and complicated, but I really believe in acknowledging that's a conscious decision women make at the same time.
Well, sure. I mean, I think that's an interesting way to look at that question. I think on the one hand, there's an agency there, there's an economic interest, and there's a way of using this activity to create that does forward a kind of self interest. I think my question still is whether or not the whole area of sexuality is something that should be submitted to market forces. I mean,
Mm.
and that's a as I was reading through, I know you sent me your comments. I was from NatCon, and I was struck by your interest in kind of tracing. This is something that there's something interesting happening here when we take this intimate activity between human persons, and then we turn that into something that is commodified. You had this great line about our sexual culture is now defined as transactional, having been molded in exchanges of data and money and clicks. I found that word transactional very interesting. What help me just to know a little bit more about what you mean by transactional? What's happening there when we take sex and we move it into the realm of a transaction?
Mm. Right. So when, let's say, teenagers are consuming pornography, it is always online pornography. It is 99% of the time, almost always, in a transaction because it is being hosted by a third party site that either collects money from them in the form of subscriptions, like on OnlyFans or certain porn websites, or it collects data, or it collects both. So that means that the company is profiting off of their sexual gratification. And so we've been sort of quickly normalized to this because it sort of happened over a couple of generations very, very rapidly. And we are sort of like the frogs in the boiling pot. People just kind of got used to it because this is how we were doing everything on the internet. We've been selling our data for every purpose. But when you think about the sort of psychological effect this has on young people who grow up trading their data multiple times a day, multiple times a week for sexual gratification without really even thinking about it. And also, on the other end of that transaction is somebody who sold their body to the third party. You don't know whether it was consensually or otherwise, but who sold their body to the third party. So on both ends of the transaction, on both ends of the consumption, there's a transaction, whether it's data or money. It's happening with the person who is being sexually gratified, and it is happening with the person who has, in some way or another, sold their intimate sexual capacity for money, data, money, whatever it is. And becoming accustomed to that is, I think, extremely disturbing because it further shifts our notion of what the like from a Christian perspective, what our bodies are built for sexually, and it completely corrodes, pushes us further and further away from the very intimate nature of sexuality and the human body, and just sort of crudely accustoms us to
Mm.
seeing it as a fundamentally, let's we hear Democrats talking about reproductive rights and with the framing of freedom over and over again this election cycle, which politically I think is very smart. But even when you're talking about IVF, when you're talking about pornography, we're getting into what you have the freedom to consume something that someone else later found to be abusive, and you have the freedom to buy it because it's something that you can rightfully trade your data for. And therefore, if you have paid with your data or if you have paid with your money, it is yours, even if that person doesn't want it to be. It's a very, very strange place to be as a species.
Well, there's so many places I want to go to start with, but I think I want to follow up with another quote from your paper. Um, Now that very strange place that this takes us as a species, I think is fascinating because there seem to be a series of unintended consequences that are now being evidenced even in data. And I want to come back at the end of this conversation to some of the moral objections and some of the ethical concerns. But the data that you brought out in your talk was I just found really interesting. I'm gonna read this quote. IFS also found that, quote, men who report having watched pornography recently, that is, in the last 24 hours, report the highest rates of loneliness. 6 and 10% of men who watch pornography in the past 24 hours, that's a total of 60%. I'm sorry, 6 and 10 men, so 60% total, say they have felt lonely or isolated at least once in the past week. And this seems to me, I'm curious what you make of this observation. This seems to me to be a misdirection of that natural erotic impulse. There is a part of human nature where we are drawn to the other. Men are drawn to women are drawn to men. And there's this natural drawing together that is ultimately, I think, for the purpose of procreation. But here we have technology offering people a fake alternative. And it's a fake alternative that is presented in very realistic images, but it misdirects the same energy that should draw us together as people. So what we have technology offering a simulacrum of sexual interaction that in reality so misdirects the very force that should draw us together as people, leaving us kind of hollowed out and empty and lonely. And it's now happening at scale enough that it's showing up in survey data. Is that accurate, or would you nuance that in a different way?
No, people should be really concerned about that. There were a lot of, even the sort of corporate press was publishing pieces on what had happened in Japan, before this became super politically charged in the United States, just about 10 years ago. You would see all kinds of pieces in legacy media wondering about, sexual culture in Japan if so many young men were finding comfort or the simulacrum of comfort, as you just said, the simulation of comfort in these non-human alternatives or these digital alternatives. And there's a quote, I think I quoted it in the speech, but there's a quote in a Free Press article that Susie Weiss wrote a couple of years ago, where she was interviewing some guy in his 20s, I think he was in his late 20s in the UK, who said basically you don't have to leave the house anymore to get a satisfying simulation of a lot of different things. If you want to get a simulation of male problem solving and action, you can play video games. You can use porn for sexual satisfaction. And what's interesting about that, you basically never have to leave the house again. You can have food delivered to you, so you don't have to do hunting and gathering in any sense at all, right? Like you don't have to garden, but you also don't even have to go to the grocery store anymore. It can all just come straight to you. If you want to escape, you don't have to go for a run necessarily. You can, smoke weed, whatever it is. It's satisfying enough to get you from day to day, even if it is not psychologically fulfilling. And I think probably the most frightening part of that is sexual gratification through these alternative channels, because the one thing that drives the human species, as we know, is reproduction. It is what gets people to hunt and gather. It is what gets people to invest in their communities and their cultures. They want to meet someone to reproduce with, and they want to make the space good for the products of their reproduction to continue to live on and to flourish. And so when you take that away and you put that in people's houses, and it becomes so advanced, whether that's in the form of OnlyFans bringing you somebody on a screen who is actually directing this to you, whether it's through virtual reality pornography, which is becoming super advanced as we talk right now, whether it's through, as silly as it sounds, dolls, which were prolific in these conversations in Japan for a really long time, whatever it is, if it becomes so close to reality, that it can get people from day to day, until they're in too much of a hole to actually find ways to reproduce in the wild, so to speak, then yeah, we are in a very dangerous situation, which is why I think we see those loneliness numbers correlating with pornography usage. There's definitely something there.
It's just heartbreaking on so many levels, and of course, as hopefully anybody watching or listening is already aware, I mean the age at which children encounter pornography just keeps sinking lower and lower. I think you talked about 12-year-olds being kind of the usual number or age at which children first encounter pornography. I want to ask you about that too for a second. You had this other great line. Most members of today's generation of children will never exist without having witnessed many strangers having sex with each other. What kind of you talked really, and I thought one of your strongest points was about the trauma that causes, particularly to children in their those formative years. So what kind of effects does watching porn at a young age have on children, on teenagers, on their own relationships, on their own mental psyche structures?
Yeah, a lot of people talk about this, I think reasonably so, in the context of some of the extreme content kids are exposed to when they are exposed to porn at the average age of 12, which is a number that we've seen come up multiple times, 12, 13, in a lot of studies. And I think there's obviously a good reason to focus on that, because most kids are exposed to like extreme pornography when they are exposed to pornography when they're teenagers. Their brains are still developing. They might likely haven't had sexual experiences of their own. We've seen this showing up in concerning ways with young women saying that they feel unsafe in sexual encounters with men who have these expectations from pornography about the way that violence should mingle with sexual intimacy. So I'm very concerned about that. But I also just wanted to focus in those remarks on how completely bizarre it is that, and how, in ways that we do not fully yet understand, that most of these kids are going to enter the dating market, enter adulthood, having watched, in some cases, hundreds, if not thousands, of strangers, people they will literally never meet or see again, uh, have in their most intimate, nude and sexually engaged in a sex act. That is changing. 100% is changing the way they see other people's bodies. It is changing the way they see their own bodies. It is changing the way they see this most basic human act of reproduction. And I would just go back to the transactional nature that we were talking before, because when you are trading your data for these, untethered to any time and space, untethered to any context, clips of other people engaged in sexual activity, when they're trading their data for that, and it's normal and it's regular and it's transactional, you can see how the intimacy of sex is just going to be corroded over and over again. Death by 1,000 cuts, death by tens of thousands of cuts for probably some of these boys by the time they hit their 20s and are seriously thinking about marriage and fatherhood. Their notion of what healthy sex is, and again, I'm coming to this from a Christian perspective. You don't necessarily need to come to it from a Christian perspective. There are some feminists that have come to conclusions that are similar to the Christian perspective, maybe through very different routes. Obviously, a lot of people are revisiting some of those, Dworkin, some of those feminist thinkers right now. But that healthy sex is between two, in a monogamous relationship, I would say a married couple, people who are, have made an oath before God. And the reason for that is because the psychological effect of sex, especially on women, is so profound. It is so meaningful. It is so chemical in ways that translate into emotional attachment. It is something to be handled with incredible delicacy for the average man and woman. And when you reach adulthood, having consumed and transacted with strangers in this way, hundreds of times, thousands of times, but even dozens of times. I mean, we would think it was traumatic if this had happened once to a child 100 years ago, let alone at the scale that it's happening now. I just think we would be foolish to assume it's not going to seriously warp our abilities just to interact as men and women.
So you're reminding me of an important section of Aristotle's book, The Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about the powerful method of habit for forming virtue. He has a couple of paragraphs where I'm going to loosely paraphrase, where Aristotle talks about the importance of virtue and how the way we actually form a virtue is by doing something over and over and over again. And the way that we know that we've actually acquired the virtue is when we realized cognitively that we ought to do something, but then we actually feel affection for that thing with our hearts. We actually want to do it. And it's the point of maturity when we choose to do the right thing, not because we know it's the right thing, but because we actually want to do it. And Aristotle argues that the way we get there is we do that thing that we cognitively know to be the right thing over and over and over and over again. And then eventually this process forms us into a courageous man, a charitable man, and so on. But in this case, we're talking about the same process happening and the same kind of formation in an incredibly degrading way. And a way that is operating on primarily on those who do not have the knowledge or life experience to know what they are choosing. And that also ties into this transactional nature. I think there's a way in which we could look at this, and I struggle sometimes with the purely free marketeering of classical liberalism, because classical liberalism, true classical liberals tend to presume that there is a completely neutral market, and that the buyer and the seller are both completely free agents, and they will work together in a mutual pursuit of their own self-interest, and is totally free. But weird things happen when we mix in the idea of addiction. And I mean, and we know this with alcohol, we know this with tobacco, with narcotics. We know that, and we can debate all day long on to what extent these things should be regulated, at what ages and how, but it's pretty obvious that we actually don't want alcohol marketed to children. That's pretty, I think, self-evidently clear. And yet here we have a transactional commodity that is kind of slipping through the regulatory framework, that is using the latest technology to present itself as a fun, enticing, but incredibly addicting and corrosive force to the youngest kids or younger kids who are not yet aware of what they're choosing when they choose to engage in that. And I just think the addiction part of pornography is one that I don't hear people bring up often enough. I think it pairs very interestingly with I hear a lot of people talk about the phone addiction, and the way that the lights and the colors are all intended to trigger our dopamine rushes. I have a bunch of friends this week who've been putting up their grayscale method for phones, and like how they can, this is going to be their way to get around the psychology of Apple or whatever. But I want to see if you had any thoughts on the where the addictive nature of pornography really comes into the story as well.
Right, I have tons of thoughts on that. Actually, I think it's one of the least appreciated undercurrents in American culture and politics is the way that technology has increasingly allowed capitalist actors to design foods, to design any given product. It's happened gradually, but sort of also all at once in the scope and span of human history, which is why we're numb to it now. But I mean, there's it's an incredibly difficult conversation about where you draw the line between, a potato chip that just tastes so good and is so salty that you keep going back for more, and where there's actually people profiting off of depriving you of agency, especially when it comes to children. So it's not an easy conversation, but it's one that I think we've really overlooked when it comes to certain things that are actually designed like food to make it very difficult for a human being to stop consuming it. We talk about Facebook, as Tristan Harris has explained, turning the notification, deciding that one way to get people to click more on their notifications is to turn the button red, which triggers in humans a very particular reaction because the color is associated with all kinds of natural things that make us that activate our brains in different ways. So there's something happening here that is intentionally depriving people of agency and profiting off of it. And it's this confluence of what Shoshana Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism and what other scholars have referred to as limbic capitalism. And when you apply that to children who can't, because their brains aren't fully formed, make a decision about their permanent digital record, having hardcore and in some cases probably illegal pornography that they don't even know is illegal pornography go on their permanent digital record with their digital footprint, and then also not they can't knowingly consent to consuming that act either. I mean, these are incredibly difficult questions that we are just like whistling right past and acting like they're nothing. So the addiction question is a huge one. If you are a young boy or a young girl and you have a developing body, a developing hormonal system, and in your pocket everywhere you go, because let's say, for example, you need a computer for school, you need an iPad for school, you need a phone in order to use public transit to get to school. You have to have it in some places. So if you have to have your phone for public transit, because that's how you get to school, and that means you have to have or constant access to all of the pornography in the world in your pocket just to get to school. And you're asking children to not utilize that and to not find ways to utilize that when their bodies are designed to seek out that sexual gratification for perfectly natural and normal purposes. That is predatory. There's no other way of looking at it, because they are children. Their brains are not fully formed, but their reproductive systems are becoming fully formed. So it's a horrible combination that is clearly predatory and should absolutely have legal boundaries, but we aren't even having a conversation about the addiction element of it. And I think that is a great point that you raise.
Let me ask you about a different line that struck me as very counterintuitive. So most of my questions I've known where I was hoping you were going to answer. This one I really don't. You wrote that fundamentally the question of modern pornography is a question of transhumanism. And I would love for you to just expand on that for a moment, because it seems that so much of pornography is a very bodily question. So where is the transhumanist element here in this very body conscious activity?
Yeah, I think online pornography and even like old school videotape pornography or magazines is one of the best examples of transhumanism, and especially in the context of us becoming quickly accustomed to it in a way that is barely objectionable. Nobody really objects to Playboy. Even people who object to modern pornography, nobody, a lot of people would be totally fine legally and morally with what Hugh Hefner was doing several decades ago. But ultimately, what pornography like that allows us to do, where it is mass distributed around the world, accessible to anyone, is transcend the boundaries of human sexuality before this technology entered the picture. So, we until industrial times, until basically modern industrial times, you had to, in order to engage in sexual gratification, you had yourself or you had another person. But it was both in person, no matter what, whether it was just yourself or whether it was another person, it was always in person. And, in order to have sexual gratification, it was, you could do it by yourself or you could have another person, but that means you would know that person, you were physically in the same place with that person, and that act stayed. No, there was no recording of it unless maybe further down the road you could write it down. You were literate, you had access to pen and paper, or it was in your imagination. But even if you were just writing about it, that's not capturing the literal act itself. So that allows us to absolutely transcend the boundaries of natural human sexual contact, and it becomes transhumanist in the sense that you can have sexual gratification. You can transcend the boundaries of the human body and our species by accessing these simulations and having sexual gratification with another person's body, even if that body is, again, in, maybe it's in, let's say, South America, maybe it's in Canada, maybe it's, anywhere, but it's not in your immediate physical community, and it never will be. And you don't have any sort of physical and then social allegiance to this person whatsoever. It's fully transactional, as we've been talking about, but that is something that's incredibly unnatural. And that's sort of where we started the conversation too. Like, in one sense, pornography is playing on the most natural instinct, in the other sense, it's giving people the most unnatural, and I would say transhuman um, avenues towards sexual gratification.
In a very real sense, these questions are not really new. I mean, as you mentioned, the questions of human sexuality go all the way back through human history. I'm going to go back again to Hammurabi's Code because that's the beginning of this Western Civ class, and I had forgotten just how big of a question this was for ancient Babylon. But I was reading through it, there are prescriptions for what it costs a man to put away his concubine, and it's different versus whether she's had a child or whether she has not. There are punishments for what happens with simple adultery, interfamilial incest. There are all of these things, all of these parameters that were legal questions roughly 5,000 years ago. And those same questions are still with us today in a lot of ways. But I think you're absolutely right about the way that this technology allows us to transcend that place element and that personal embodiment, and the fact that that gratification no longer requires actually being physically present in that way. That's a significant change. And that
Mm-hmm.
Hammurabi was not having to deal with that 5,000 years ago. That's something that in a very real way, our technology has both enabled and has offered us new avenues of sort of self-enslavement. We talked earlier, I know, about the slavery analogy, and I think it's so interesting that it would take a massive social change for the modern world to sort of actually just decide we're going to ban pornography. Like that would take on the level of a Supreme Court decision that was actually backed by Congress and the president. Like, there would have to be massive universal agreement. I don't know that will actually occur, but there is something there about recognizing just how inhumane this activity is, and without denigrating the agency or the personhood of people who choose to engage in that for whatever reason. There's something about, I think there's something incredibly valuable of recognizing, like, you should not willingly enslave yourself to this without knowing what you're doing. And that too puts an incredibly high value on thinking through, like, what can we do socially, societally, to protect children from these influences, because they're the ones with the least ability to make that choice in a rational way.
Benedict option, right? And I know there's a lot of debate about that. I say it sort of tongue in cheek, but really the way to protect children from this is to properly educate them on a life of virtue, what it means to live a life of virtue, because what's terrifying to anyone should be the destruction of their soul. And if you are or the corrosion of their soul. And even if you're a child, this isn't to engage in fear mongering, obviously, but as to convey fully how destructive some of these totally normalized practices in modern life are to their futures, their ability to have flourishing, happy, healthy futures, no matter what their bodies are telling them when they're young, and no matter what the culture is telling them when they're young. So I think that's a really important part of it. And I don't think, I mean, it gets to this big conversation about, IVF and, prostitution, all of these tough questions. Pornography is obviously a part of it. It's really tough because on a legislative level, the American people are not with, pretty hardcore pro-lifers like myself who don't, necessarily believe in categorical legal exceptions for incest, for example, in these horrible case studies of women who are abused by family members, the worst possible situation. For a politician to not support an exception for that is basically impossible right now, because they would have to explain the deeper questions of what it means to value all human life, regardless of the circumstances of conception. That a baby, it is not the baby's fault, that is a human baby, and it is not the baby's fault that the circumstances of its conception were abusive and horrific and tragic. And the American public doesn't see that life as life because of many reasons. If you don't see that embryonic phase of the baby, then you're just you're not even going to be able to speak in the same language. And I think that's a huge part of the problem with this porn discourse, is that we fundamentally see it as empowering. As much as I love Camille Paglia, she won the Paglia versus Dworkin arguments about pornography in the late 80s and early 90s. Camille Paglia won that conversation in the broader culture. And because of that, we see it as fundamentally empowering. And I know I even used that word earlier in this conversation, empowering agency. And I think there's something to that women are absolutely choosing this. But whether it is actually morally empowering, it may empower you to make a certain decision. But is that decision itself empowering? I think no, of course not. But the culture sees this as a question of freedom as opposed to a question of abuse. And you actually just are going to have a horrible time legislating until the cultural conversation about the morality is won, or that tug of war goes further in a virtuous direction. So it's so hard to even have these conversations, especially in secular contexts.
Um, I think that's really true. It reminds me of the life of William Wilberforce in England, and spending a lifetime really working to change the narrative of slavery, and looking around at England and seeing slavery as a great social evil and a harm, not just to the slaves, but also to those who participated in purchasing and owning and directing slaves. He has some fascinating passages about the way that the very ability to own a person is corrosive. Like no human being should have that power and control over another human being, he thinks. But really, it took him, I'd have to look up the dates, but it was a 50, 60-year personal crusade through the halls of Parliament to eventually achieve that legislative victory. And my guess, I always like to end my episodes on a sort of a hopeful turn. I don't know if we're going to get there with this one, because this is a relatively dark spot for American culture today, and that's just limiting it to our particular country. This is not just an American problem. This is a global problem, a Western problem. But if there's hope, I don't know that I don't think we're yet at the place where we can reach really for a legislative solution. This is a storytelling solution that has to win the hearts and minds of people and convince them that this actually is evil, which ultimately requires recovering something we've sort of culturally given away, a broad consensus view of what is good and what is evil and what even is the human person. Like this is still even this issue is downstream, I think, ultimately from theological concerns. But it's really telling that story and helping more people see this is not just a laugh line on your favorite comedy show, which is, it is, I didn't notice this until a couple of months ago, but it has, in the last 20 years, I think 20 years is a reasonable span. If you go back to a TV show from before 2004, I don't think you're going to find many mainstream shows that use like characters viewing porn as like an obvious throwaway line. But it's totally ordinary today. Like if telling the story and convincing enough people that this is a harm, this is wrong, and it does in fact harm people. I think that's where we are culturally as far as like looking for change. Do you see different avenues for where do we go from here? Like, what do we actually do to create better systems for people?
Yeah, it's the most important question. And I, and so I'm always like toggling back and forth in my own mind between whether we're getting closer or further away, because, the fact that the quote I mentioned from the Free Press recently was even given by that young man, about how he's experiencing these ultimately unfulfilling but immediately satisfying simulations of daily life. The fact that he's even cognizant of that, I think, is a positive. But it's obviously a negative that the systems of limbic capitalism that continue preying on him will keep getting many, many, many more people through day to day without creating incentives for ultimate fulfillment and flourishing. So people are realizing it, but we're people at the end of the day. We need to be strong enough, and we're not. We're fallen. And so it's hard to say whether we're going in a good direction or a bad direction. If it's getting better, if it's getting worse with everyone's awareness, but there is increasing awareness. So maybe the answer is it's going to have to get worse to get better.
It certainly might. Well, Emily, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been a delightful conversation. Before we wrap up, could you plug your podcast one more time? I know you mentioned it at the beginning, but to remind our viewers and listeners about your show and what they can expect from it.
Sure, it's called Undercurrents. You can it's a daily news podcast. It's on YouTube, but you can also listen as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify. We've got cool guests, so definitely having a lot of fun with that, and appreciate people tuning in.
Oh, fantastic. Well, hopefully folks listening to the show will take advantage of that and subscribe first to The Optimistic Curmudgeon, but then also to Undercurrents. Well, thank you, Emily, for joining me today for this conversation. And thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us today here on The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest has been Emily Jashinsky of Unherd and Undercurrents. You've been listening to another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to hit the subscribe button and share it with your friends. If you want to let me know what you thought about the episode, or if you want to sponsor an episode, you can always message me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Just search for The Optimistic Curmudgeon. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Until next time, seek the good, pursue the true, and love the beautiful.